The stars were dying, not in fire or violence, but in silence, fading, forgotten. The galaxy stretched like a wound across the night, bleeding the last golden age into cold oblivion. Entire constellations blinked out like the embers of an ancient hearth. The great beacons of the Astronomicon sputtered. Black holes yawned wider, and the void grew louder. And Terra, cradle of humanity, throne of empire, final promise of salvation, trembled beneath her sky. We who lived through it speak now only in whispers. Those who remember do not sleep, and those who forget are devoured in dreams. What was lost in those final days was not only an empire, but the memory of what it meant to believe in one. But before the silence fell, there was a sound, a voice echoing across 10,000 years of triumph and tyranny. And before the darkness came, there was still light, the dying breath of a god. We tell this tale not as scholars, but as witnesses. We truly love and care for you, whoever you are. You who listen now, know that you are not alone. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. They called it the Golden Throne, but in truth it was a tomb. At the heart of the imperial palace, buried beneath mountains of adamantium and forgotten truths, he sat, the emperor of mankind, master of the Imperium, father of demigods, dreamer of unity. No longer did he walk the stars, no longer did he speak. The throne drank from him now, each breath a tithe, each heartbeat a sacrifice. He had not moved in 10,000 years. Yet on that day, something stirred. Deep in the mechanicum vaults of Mars, a signal flared. Not a transmission, not a frequency, a voice. A single phrase carried on no known wavelength, recorded in no human tongue. A whisper that made no sound, yet ruptured the minds of 4 adepts before containment protocols initiated. They could not translate it, they could not locate it. But the signal had one undeniable origin. The edge of Segmentum Pacificus from a dead world whose sun had long since collapsed. It was a name, his name. In the palace's deepest sanctum, the custodes shifted uneasily. These were not warriors accustomed to doubt. They had guarded the emperor since before most stars had cooled. They did not fear death. But as the echo of the signal reached the throne room, passing through null fields, warp seals, and psychic wards older than language, they felt something impossible, a shudder. Not of Earth, not of the vault, but of the throne itself. It was as though the emperor had exhaled, and the one who felt it most, more than the guards, more than the psychers monitoring the golden throne, was Malcador, or what remained of him. Malcador the Sigillite had died long ago. His bones had crumbled, his name enshrined. But echoes remain of those who die for gods. The emperor had not spoken of Malcador in millennia, not once, not even to his sons. But now he remembered. Within the walls of his mind, vaster than systems, older than creation, something flickered. A memory, a corridor of stone, warm firelight, laughter between friends, and then pain. He had ordered Malcador to the throne in his place once, just once, a test, a sacrifice. And Malcador had borne it without question, had smiled as his flesh boiled away, as his soul fractured, for the Imperium, for unity, for him. The Emperor did not weep. He had long since forgotten how, but somewhere, behind the armor of thought and will, he felt something crack, a memory of love, of friendship, of what he had lost. Elsewhere in the palace, the High Lords argued. The Adeptus Administratum feared a collapse of faith. The Ecclesiarchy cried heresy. The Inquisition murmured of demonic influence, but no one dared approach the throne. Only one being could. Ra, Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, golden as the dawn before Terra fell. Silent as ever, he stood at the foot of the throne, waiting, watching. He had watched the Emperor for 10,000 years. He had seen every twitch, every breath, every moment of stillness. But today he saw something else. Movement, so slight it could not be real. But real it was. The Emperor's head, ever forward, ever fixed, tilted, not left, not right, upper, as though hearing a voice from above or beyond. Ra said nothing, but he lowered his spear. Far above Terra, in orbit where void shields shimmered against starlight, a vessel broke into real space. It bore no heraldry, no IFF signature, no warp trace. It had not traveled through the warp. It had not traveled at all. It was there. Then it wasn't. Then it was. The ship was shaped like no known vessel, blacker than vacuum. Its hull hummed, not with engines, but with something deeper, like memory. And from within it, the signal pulsed once more, this time louder. The mechanicum screamed, astropaths clawed out their eyes. The black ships went silent. Only the Emperor listened, because he knew that voice, and it knew him. Why now? The thought was not spoken. It did not need to be. Time was irrelevant to him. He had waited 10 millennia. He could wait 10 more. But something in the voice called him back, not to war, not to glory, but to guilt. For before there were Primarchs, before the Imperium, before the Thunder Warriors and the first unity of Terra, there had been a bargain, a truth he had buried beneath layers of lies, locked behind seals of divinity and myth. And now, the key had returned. He remembered the day he broke the pact, the day he said no, the day he walked away from the only being who had ever understood the cost of forever. There was movement in the stars again, or perhaps there was something beneath them, moving unseen. The Inquisition deployed kill teams to the Pacificus fringe. None returned. Black ships sent into the void vanished before their second jump. The Adeptus Mechanicus, in their endless hunger for truth, sent probes into the dying system. The footage was clear. The world was dead. But the sun was waking. A black dwarf, long since gone cold, pulsed with impossible light. Not fire, not fusion, but memory. As though the star remembered what it once was, and had chosen to burn again. And as the light touched the fleet's command ship, it was gone, erased, not destroyed, forgotten. Their names vanished from the new spheric archives, their gene tags wiped from the banks. It was as if they had never existed. Only the Emperor remembered, because he had made the same mistake once. Beneath the throne, in a chamber sealed before the Imperium was born, something opened. A sarcophagus, not for the dead, but for a memory too dangerous to be buried. It bore no markings, no inscriptions, just a single phrase, etched in a language older than Terra's oceans. He who refused. Inside, nothing but dust, and the echo of a voice that said, "I forgive you." The Emperor opened his eyes. The stars outside Terra wept in silence. The High Lords did not know. The Primarchs had vanished. The people still prayed to a god who had stopped listening. But something had changed. He was no longer alone. And across the galaxy, something stirred, something that had once walked beside him, and now returned not in vengeance, but in warning. Not all betrayals were born of hatred. Some were born of love. The sigillite was dead. His bones, long turned to dust, rested beneath the vaults of Terra. His name was honored, yet never spoken aloud by those who still remembered him. Malcador, the hero. Malcador, the sacrifice. Malcador, the forgotten. But there are echoes in silence, shadows left by souls too bright to fade. And on that day, in the wake of the returning signal, the echoes stirred. The Emperor sat immobile atop the golden throne, but within the furnace of his consciousness, he walked again. In halls built of thought and memory, he stood beneath a long-extinct sun, its warmth artificial, yet more comforting than the reality of Terra's poisoned skies. This place did not exist, not in stone or flesh. It was a prison of recollection. And in this quiet place, he was not a god. He was just a man who remembered the friend he had condemned to die. They had built the dream together, before the legions, before the warp, before the Great Crusade. Back then, the vision was smaller, a unified Terra, a cradle for a species on the brink of extinction. No angels, no demons, no gods. Malcador had seen the world for what it was, bitter, cruel, forgetful. Yet he had believed in the man who dreamed. Even when that dream grew teeth, the Emperor had needed minds to anchor his vision. Loyal, brilliant, unafraid. Malcador was the first, the only one he could not predict, the only one who could look at him without flinching. They had disagreed. Often. You seek to shape humanity, Malcador had once said, but shaping clay too tightly only leaves it brittle. And yet we shape it still, the Emperor had replied, or leave it to ruin. Neither had been wrong. When the time came to sacrifice one, Malcador offered himself before being asked. He had known, perhaps he had always known. The Emperor remembered that final moment, not the agony of Malcador's soul burning upon the throne, but the look in his eyes as he crumbled to ash. Forgiveness, not worship, not fear, just forgiveness. And now, after 10,000 years of silence, the signal had spoken with his voice. Was it a trick? A warp echo? Some blasphemous machine imitation? Number. He knew. It was him. The custodes did not speak of it, but they watched. The Emperor's body did not move, but something in the air changed. Subtle, indescribable, like the pressure before a storm, or the moment before a heart breaks. And behind the golden helm of the Captain General, Ra considered what only a few dared, that the god they served was remembering. And elsewhere in the palace, deep beneath the surface of Terra, a chamber long sealed by forgotten edict groaned open. Access was granted not by command codes, but by presence. The door recognized the soul approaching. Genera Cull, a lexicanum of the Ordo Chronos, stepped into the chamber barefoot, unarmed, unbidden. The corridor behind her shimmered with temporal interference. To her, no time had passed since her last entry. But on Terra's clocks, it had been over 4,000 years. She had been sent into stasis before the scouring, tasked with cataloguing time anomalies. She had never expected to wake again, and yet something had called her back. Not a voice, not an order, a need. In the chamber, the stasis glass was shattered. The sealed memory vault hummed. She approached the terminal, brushing away layers of golden dust. One file blinked on screen. Echo/sigillite/mirrored thought/protocol 1 resumed. Her breath caught, not because of the message, but because she recognized the encryption. It was written in Malcador's hand. Across the palace, the High Lords debated the incident with increasing desperation. Some demanded war, some insisted on silence. One, Lord Vanna of the Administratum, proposed purging every astropath within 5 sectors to sever the signal. Better to be deaf than deceived, he spat. Better to be extinct than blind, replied Gios Amek, the inquisitorial envoy. But none dared bring the question to the throne. Not yet. In the whispering recesses of the Black Library, a figure in gold and shadow sifted through impossible tomes. Not Eldar, not human. Something between. She had no name, only function. She was a librarian of lost bargains, and what she found that day was old. Very old, an oath made between 2 beings. One forged from pure will, the other from ancient sacrifice. The scroll bore no ink, only light burned into parchment, and on it a name never meant to be read again. She paused. Not all betrayals, she whispered, are born of hatred. Then she closed the book and vanished from time. Back on Terra, the Emperor dreamed. In the waking dream of his inner sanctum, the corridor shifted. Walls dissolved into mist. Light became memory. And there, at the end of the path, stood a figure in grey robes, his face lined with wisdom and weariness. Malkador. You never listen, the image said softly. You're not real, the Emperor replied. No, the figure agreed, but I never was. Not to them. They stood in silence. Why now? The Emperor asked. Because you need to remember. I remember everything. Malkador smiled, that same tired, knowing smile. Then why are you so afraid? The Emperor said nothing. Malkador stepped closer. You buried it. Him. You. The part that dared to dream without command, without control. I had no choice, the Emperor said. Malkador shook his head. There's always a choice. You taught me that. Then you forgot. And with that, the vision faded, but the echo remained. Janira Call stood before the open vault, trembling. Inside, hundreds of thought memories, gestalts encoded directly from Malkador's soul before his final moment, flared to life. Each one bore a title: Hope in Ashes, The Emperor Before the Lie, Unity Without Chains, What We Were. She reached for one, hand shaking. It whispered to her, not in sound, but feeling. Love, regret, resolve. She fell to her knees. These were not the records of a servant. These were the thoughts of a friend. The Emperor stirred once more, not visibly, not in movement, but in mind. The echo of Malkador had awakened more than memory. It had rekindled a truth long buried beneath dogma and divine artifice. He had not always been a god. He had once been a man, and that man had dared to trust another. Now, as the Imperium began to fracture from within and without, he felt the sting of that old truth return. Trust is the rarest currency among immortals, and perhaps the most dangerous. Outside the throne world, the ship still lingered. It did not move. It did not attack. It simply was. An eternal reminder that something had been forgotten. Not a threat, a question. And across Terra, beneath its towers and cathedrals and lies, the memory of Malkador moved again. Not in body, but in thought. And for the first time in millennia, the Emperor considered something. Not strategy, not survival, not dominance, but forgiveness. He was the brightest star they had ever known, the War Master, architect of the Crusade's greatest victories, voice of the legions, chosen son of the Emperor. Entire sectors bore his seal. Civilizations had bent the knee, not through force, but by the sheer gravity of his presence. And yet, in the silence of his private chambers aboard the Vigilant Star, Horus Lupercal stood alone. There were no banners here, no fanfare. only the distant hum of power conduits and the dull ache of memory. He traced a finger along the cracked edge of the obsidian relic that sat before him, a medallion once gifted by the Emperor, back when they had still spoken as father and son. It had broken on Ulanor, not during battle, not from an enemy strike, but afterward, the moment he was named War Master, the moment it all began to unravel. He hadn't asked for the title. It had been given, bestowed like a crown made of thorns. The Emperor had withdrawn from the front lines soon after, locking himself away on Terra for his great work, a mystery even to his sons. Horus had smiled, knelt, accepted the weight of the Imperium. But deep beneath the surface of that moment, there had been silence, a hesitation. He remembered the moment of coronation, not for the cheers, but for the way the Emperor looked at him, proud, but distant, like he was already saying goodbye. The other Primarchs had reacted as expected. Some had embraced him, others had bristled. Lorgar had bowed too deeply. Perturabo had gritted his teeth behind a hollow smile. Robut had measured him, as always, like a number to be calculated. Only Sanguinius had truly understood. "You wear a crown of flame, brother," he had said that night, "and it will burn everything you love if you're not careful." Horus had laughed it off then, but the burn had begun that day, and it had not stopped since. On the bridge of the Vigilant Star, the Legion waited, sons of Horus, clad in emerald and iron, each one a living monument to conquest. Their armor bore scars older than many planets. Their loyalty was absolute, but even among them, whispers had begun, whispers of abandonment, of silence from terror, of a god who had turned inward while his galaxy bled. In his command sanctum, Horus activated the hololithic display. Dozens of fronts, systems in rebellion, Xenos threats flaring like embers in a dying furnace. The eastern fringe teetered on collapse. The ghoul stars whispered again. And Terra? Nothing. No orders, no guidance, just silence. As if the Emperor had retreated not only from the stars, but from him. Horus clenched his fists. He had given everything, led the crusade, unified thousands of worlds, broken empires, bled with his sons, and still, no word, no trust, only absence. There had been a time when the Emperor had spoken to him directly, in moments of pain, doubt, triumph, not as a soldier, not as a weapon, but as a son. He remembered walking with the Emperor across the broken plains of Genna Prime, after the war, just the two of them, no guards, no armor. The Emperor had spoken then, not of war, but of stars, of the future. "You will carry what I cannot," he had said. "When I must step away, it will be you who holds the dream." Horus had believed him, but belief, like relics, can crack with time. Now, in the cold echo of command, Horus felt the weight of a different voice, a whisper, faint, unseen, crawling in the corners of his thoughts. It did not speak words. It offered no commands. It offered understanding. "Do you feel it too, brother?" The voice came not from within, but from the corridor. Horus turned, hand resting on the haft of his mace, though he knew he wouldn't need it. Sanguinius stood there, wings cloaked in shadow, eyes calm, but edged with concern. "I didn't summon you," Horus said, a tired smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You didn't need to," Sanguinius replied, stepping into the light. "I felt you." They embraced as brothers, as warriors, as sons born of the same impossible father. "You're not sleeping," Sanguinius said, voice gentle. Horus shook his head. The stars are louder than sleep. Still no word from him. Horus gestured to the silent hololith. The silence was its own answer. I think, Horus said slowly, he's forgotten what it means to lead. Or perhaps, to trust. Sanguinius said nothing, but he did not deny it. You're not alone in your doubts, the angelic Primarch finally said. Many feel it. Gilliman hides it in protocol. Dawn in stone. Even Magnus hides it in fire, Horus interrupted. A shared chuckle, then quiet again. Horus looked to the broken medallion. Did we ever matter? Or were we just tools? Sanguinius stepped forward, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. We mattered, he said. We still matter. But even gods can forget their creations, especially when they begin to believe they were always divine. Later, when Sanguinius had gone, and the bridge lights dimmed into artificial dusk, Horus stood alone again. He looked at the broken medallion in his palm. Once he had cherished it. Now it cut deeper than any blade. Elsewhere, far across the stars, a signal stirred. It moved like a ripple across calm water. It passed through systems untouched by warp, through blackened moons, through hollow stars. And when it reached the vigilant star, it paused. Horus felt it like a breath on the back of his mind. He turned. No sound, no light, just a memory of Malkador, of that quiet man who had once told him, long before Ulanor, beware the moment you stop questioning. It will be the day your love becomes obedience, and your obedience becomes blindness. Horus had not understood then, but now he felt it. That night he dreamed of Terra, but not the throne, not the palace, of Earth, verdant and alive. Oceans, wind, sky untainted by ash. And the Emperor, not as a god, but as a man, sitting beside him beneath the old trees of Europa. The dream ended with the Emperor saying something he had never said in life. I'm sorry. Horus awoke in silence, but something inside him had shifted. He rose, walked to the communications core, and sent a signal not to Terra, but to Magnus, the one who heard things no one else dared, the one who might understand what he could not yet say. The message was brief. Tell me what you've seen. I'm ready to listen. Outside, the stars over Ulanor dimmed. A sign. A coincidence. Perhaps neither. Perhaps the galaxy was listening. And in the heart of Terra, upon the golden throne, the Emperor stirred again, not in body, but in awareness. The thread between father and son had been touched, not in hate, not yet, but in doubt. And that was how it always began. They had thought him lost, one of the two forgotten, the second spoken of only in footnotes, silences, and censored histories. His name was stricken from every data vault, his deeds erased from battle records, his brothers ordered never to speak of him again. But memory is a stubborn thing, and even gods cannot unmake the truth forever. He returned not in fire nor thunder, but in stillness. One moment, the observatory stations around the edge of Segmentum Obscurus reported dead air, blank readings, null returns. The next, a presence eclipsed the stars, a world ship, black as entropy, cloaked in gravity and memory. And aboard it, a figure stepped forward from the void, a Primarch, but not as he had been. He had no name anymore, not in the tongues of man. What had once been flesh and fire was now something far older. His form shimmered, caught between real space and something deeper. His armor bore no sigils, no chapter markings, only the swirling patterns of mathematics too pure for any mortal tongue. His eyes were like singularities, pulling light into memory. He walked with silence, but the air around him trembled, like a planet on the verge of tectonic collapse. And wherever he went, machinery ceased to function, not from damage, but from awareness, as if even the cold logic of machines recognized that this being did not belong, not anymore. He arrived on the world of Sion Viv, a former forge world now reduced to silent ash. No one had lived there in over a century, but he was not there for the living. He walked the ruins alone, trailing his fingers across melted ferrocrete, shattered cogitator banks, and rusted shrines. And then, beneath a collapsed manufactory, he found what he was searching for. A relic vault, unopened since the Great Crusade. It recognized him. Of course it did. The machine's spirit within wept, not in pain, in recognition, and opened. Within, there lay only one item, a sealed scroll, woven in psycho-reactive metal, bound in void glass. Singing softly in no audible key, he unsealed it with a gesture, not of hand, of memory, and read the words written there, his own words, from before exile, before the lie. He remembered the moment his father turned away. It was not rage that ended him, not judgment. It was silence, a denial of existence so total, so deliberate, that it erased more than records. It erased meaning. He had asked a question, only one. Why must we blind ourselves to what we were before? And for that, the Emperor had turned from him, had buried his name beneath the bedrock of imperial truth. But he had not stopped seeking answers. And now, 10,000 years later, he had found one. The dead forge world groaned beneath his feet. Wind whispered across skeletal spires. He stood unmoved, and in his hand the scroll burned with knowledge. Ancient, forbidden, not from the warp, older than it. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in centuries, he spoke, not aloud, but through the fabric of reality itself, and something answered. On Mars, the Mechanicum screamed. Across red deserts and data vault cathedrals, machine priests fell to their knees, not in pain, not in worship, in terror. A signal unlike any other raced across the noosphere, outside of known logic, beyond current laws of computation. It described a shape with no beginning, a number with no end, a language whose grammar rewrote your thoughts as you read it. The tech priests called it omnicryptic refraction, the transmission of unmaking. Only one individual among them understood it, Magos Dexiarch Helor. He was ancient, even by Martian standards. Half a mind suspended in a stasis loop, the other half a neural matrix connected directly to the Noctis labyrinth. And when he read the signal, he laughed, not in madness, but in recognition. I warned them, he said, as his heart finally stopped. And still, he laughed. Back in Segmentum Obscurus, the Primarch looked up. He was not smiling, but he was at peace. The scroll evaporated in his hand, not burned, not destroyed, accepted, a key inserted into a lock long forgotten. And somewhere, far beyond the veil of reality, something turned, not toward him, but toward terror. Meanwhile, Horus received the response to his message. Magnus had sent no words, only a vision, a red flame, and within it, a name, Orpheus, a name thought erased, a name that, even now, caused the databanks aboard the Vigilant Star to glitch and tremble. Horus stared at the display, his sons gathered in silence behind him. My brother lives, he said. No one answered, because they had seen the footage too. A black-clad figure walking through ash, untouched by time, and the knowledge in his eyes. It was not human. It was something else. On Terra, the Emperor felt it. A thread, severed long ago, pulling taut once more. He had not spoken of Orpheus in 10,000 years. Not to the High Lords, not to the Custodes, not to his sons, not even to himself. The guilt was too sharp, too deep, because Orpheus had not fallen to chaos. He had not rebelled. He had simply asked, and for that, the Emperor had exiled him from memory. But now the silence was broken, and with it, the first true tremor in the foundations of the Imperium. Below the throne, in the sealed archives of the Silent Order, the Sisters of Silence felt the shift. Without words, without thought. They knew. The Forgotten One walked again, and their oldest vows, made in blood and fire, stirred once more. One among them, Veritas Ven, approached the mirror vault. She had sworn never to open it, had sworn to guard it until the end of time. But now her hand moved without hesitation. The mirror shimmered, and within it, Orpheus stared back, not aged, not broken, but changed. He did not speak, but the meaning was clear. I remember everything. And far across the galaxy, on the edge of the black nebulae, the stars shifted, not from motion, but from intention. The cosmos itself, ancient and half asleep, began to stir. Orpheus had returned, and with him, the question that had once broken a god. In the 21st hour of the solar cycle, the Emperor broke his silence, not with words, but with motion. Within the deepest sanctum of the imperial palace, a place untouched even by the custodes, he moved. For the first time in centuries, the golden figure on the throne leaned forward, ever so slightly. Only the mechanicum who monitored the throne's stasis field noticed it, and even they dared not speak of what they saw, not even to each other, because in that fractional tilt of divine posture, they saw the future beginning to crack. He had felt Orpheus, not as an echo, not as a fragment of the past, but as a presence. And more importantly, he had seen the question return. On Luna, the tides broke in unnatural patterns. The astroseismologists who monitored the moon's gravimetric fields reported waves that moved against time, shock fronts rising before impact, echoes of events that had not yet occurred. But the Sisters of Silence knew. They stood atop the monolithic Paragon Keep, eyes closed, arms folded over their chests. There were no words between them. There never were. Yet in that stillness, they communed with perfect unity. The vow of silence was never meant to be only a shield. It was a lens. And now it was focusing on the soul of a lost brother. Somewhere out there, Orpheus was speaking again. Not in the language of mortals, but in the dialect of causality itself. Elsewhere, deep in the warp-frozen depths of the vigilant star, Horus stood before the old reliquary chamber, one he had sealed long ago, the chamber where Orpheus's armor had once been kept. The relics had long since been removed, their inscriptions burned from memory, but the walls still remembered. So did Horus. He remembered the last time he had seen his brother, fierce-eyed, relentless, always chasing truth, not for power, but for clarity. Orpheus had never feared the warp. He had feared ignorance. It was what made him dangerous. It was also what made him irreplaceable. And now, the ghost of that clarity was creeping back into Horus's thoughts, like rust into a blade. Loken approached quietly. "You think it's really him?" Horus didn't answer right away. His voice, when it came, was not that of the War Master. It was that of a brother. I know it's him. The question is, who is he now? Far beyond Imperial reach, on a world that did not exist on any star chart, Orpheus walked through ruins of glass and bone. The planet had no name. Not anymore. The Eldar had once called it Kael Shanna, the Forgotten Heart. Here, before the fall, the Farseers had glimpsed the birth of the great enemy. Here, they had buried prophecies too dangerous even for them to utter, and Orpheus had come to dig them up. He walked through dreams carved into matter. Towers of psionic crystal still hummed with pain. The ghosts of vanished empires watched him without judgment. In his hands, he held no weapon, and yet every step he took bent the air around him. He reached the sanctum of mirrors, past the psychic wards meant to keep even gods out, and stood before the final reflection. His own face stared back at him, but younger, idealized, unscarred, a version of himself from before exile. It spoke first. You should not have come here. Orpheus didn't blink. I had no choice. There is always a choice, the mirror said. That's what you taught me. A pause. You are not who you were, it added. No, Orpheus said quietly. I am all of who I was, and more. He reached out, placing his hand against the mirror. It shattered, not in violence, in release. And behind it, a single glyph, Eldar in origin, but older than even they. It meant undoing. Back on Terra, Malkador the Sigillite stood before the Emperor's throne with his hands clasped, lips thin, and heart heavy. He had felt the tremors too. Not in space, but in the soul of the Imperium. The return of the forgotten Primarch was not simply the rise of a new player. It was the unraveling of a lie so fundamental that its exposure could destroy everything. He remembered the day Orpheus had been cast out. It had not been a trial. It had been a decision, swift, merciless, executed not because of corruption, but because Orpheus had spoken a truth that threatened the entire design of the Imperial truth. The warp was not the enemy. The lie was. And now, that truth walked again. In a distant vault aboard the black ships, a child screamed. A psyker, barely 6 years old, her eyes wide and full of stars. She had been quiet for days, ever since being taken from her family. But now she howled, not from pain, but from understanding. She spoke one sentence, over and over. The star is falling. The star is falling. The star is falling. And then she went silent again. Her heartbeat slowed, her body convulsed, and she died. Not from any known cause, but from memory of something that had not yet occurred. The High Lords of Terra convened in panic. Reports filtered in from across the segmenti. Machine spirits refusing to respond to standard binharic. Astropaths experiencing spontaneous blindness. Navigators reporting false stars, moving in spirals no human ship could follow. And most disturbing of all, Orpheus's image transmitted into cogitator archives that had been sealed since the Great Crusade. It wasn't an attack. It was a reminder of what had been buried and what was coming back. Veritas Ven, the highest of the Silent Order, meditated in the starlit vault. The memory of the mirror burned behind her eyes. She did not fear Orpheus. She feared what he had become. In their last encounter, she had been an initiate. He had spared her, even as he was being condemned. She had asked why. He had said, "You listened." That is rare, even among the silent. Now the galaxy would have to listen, or it would burn. She rose and whispered a vow, not with sound, but with thought. "I will find you, Orpheus. not to stop you, to understand. And far above, in the black between galaxies, the thing that had watched Orpheus stir once more. It was not warp-born. It was not even a creature, in the sense mortals understood. It was a concept, the first thought that emerged in the dark after the universe cooled. And it was watching the galaxy prepare to betray itself all over again. But this time, it would not remain still. Not while Orpheus moved. Because Orpheus did not serve chaos. He did not serve order. He served the answer. And that, above all else, was the most dangerous thing in existence. He awoke beneath a sky he did not recognize. It was not the void of space, nor the burning canopy of a world in ruin. It was something between, a half-light suspended over a graveyard of memories. Orpheus rose from where he had lain, his armor singing quietly as it shifted, reshaping around him like a second skin. The world was silent, but not empty. He was being watched, not by creatures, but by the eyes of history. This place was a consequence, not a battlefield, a monument. He was back on Nemoris, but it was not the Nemoris he had known. Once, it had been a world of towering crystal spires and infinite knowledge, guarded by an ancient race, long since reduced to myth. The Necrontyr had burned it to ash in their war against the Old Ones. And later, during the Great Crusade, it had been declared forbidden, buried under sealed protocols and erased from imperial records. But Orpheus had remembered, because this was where he had found the first question. The glyphs were still etched into the obsidian monoliths. The warp is not a lie. The lie is how we choose to see it. He had been a loyal son once. He had led 1,000 campaigns across 100 systems. He had watched stars die in the name of unity. And still, here, on this broken world, he had begun to understand the cost. It was not chaos that had made the galaxy bleed. It was the denial of truth. And for that, his father had cast him out. Not in rage, but in fear. He ran a hand across the surface of the pillar. It was warm to the touch, still alive, still waiting. A low hum began to rise around him. He closed his eyes and listened. On Terra, the Emperor did not move again, but the throne did. The Mechanicum priesthood surrounding the Golden Throne were the first to die. Not from violence, from sheer overload, as data surged through the throne's neuropsychic interfaces in volumes that no mind, no matter how enhanced, could withstand. The machine shrieked. For precisely 11 seconds, every soul across Terra felt the same pressure behind their eyes. And then it ended. But those who were sensitive, psychers, dreamers, children, remembered. A single image burned into their minds like a holy brand. A figure of gold and black, standing amidst ruins, holding something that burned with impossible light. They did not know his name, but they would soon. Loken sat in silence within his private chamber aboard the Vigilant Star. He had just received word from Malkador. The Emperor was aware, and the Sigillite was concerned. That alone would have shaken anyone. But what troubled Loken more was what Horus had said before leaving the Strategium hours earlier. What if we were wrong? What if Father was wrong? There had been a long pause. What if the thing we feared was never the warp at all? Loken didn't answer then. He couldn't. But now, alone, he dared to whisper, "Then we have become its lie." The warp stirred, not in madness, but in curiosity. The return of Orpheus had not gone unnoticed by the ruinous powers. Tzeentch spun labyrinths of thought around his image, seeking angles never considered. Nurgle chuckled in his garden, already savouring the rot of certainty his return would bring. Slanesh whispered long-forgotten names that once belonged to Orpheus, from lives even he had not lived. But it was Khorne who stayed silent longest. When he finally stirred, he did not rage. He merely said, "He walks again. Let the galaxy bleed before he speaks." Because if Orpheus was allowed to finish his thought, even gods could die. Veritas, then, stood on the command bridge of the black ship Unspoken Grace, en route to the edge of Segmentum Solar. She had found traces of Orpheus, psychic echoes too complex to be random, too precise to be coincidence. He was heading somewhere ancient, somewhere that was supposed to be buried, and she was going to follow. As she adjusted the null fields around her armor, her second-in-command, Sister Kane, spoke. "Jush, softly. Do we intend to stop him, Mother Veritas?" Veritas turned, her expression unreadable. "No." "Then what?" "To witness," she said, "before we forget what truth looks like." Far below the surface of Nemoris, Orpheus entered the last chamber. It was not constructed. It was grown, a living architecture of sentient matter, built by the minds of a civilization that had never known speech, only thought. At the center, a throne, not of power, of memory. He sat, and the chamber responded. It did not show him images. It unfolded him. Every moment of his life, every battle, every betrayal, every unspoken word, laid bare. He saw himself standing beside Horus on Ulanor. He saw his brothers raising their blades in silent accusation as the Emperor passed judgment. He saw the Emperor's face, not in anger, but in disappointment. "You are not ready for this truth, my son," he whispered now, as the chamber burned around him. "I was. You were not." And then the stars blinked, one by one, as if the galaxy were closing its eyes. On Mars, the Fabricator General fell to his knees. His forge world had received a data surge, unlike any ever recorded. A schematic that described an impossible machine. A device capable of filtering psychic resonance into pure intention. No known race could have conceived it. But it was written in the Primarch's script. Orpheus. The tech priests trembled, not because it was heresy, but because it was true. In the Eye of Terror, Abaddon the Despoiler stood at the edge of madness, feeling something shift. Not warp storms, not imperial defenses, but conviction. The galaxy had always moved in lies. That was its shape, its natural law. But now a new gravity was forming, and it pulled toward a name most had forgotten. He clenched his fist. Orpheus had not returned to lead a rebellion. He had returned to ask a question, and it was that question that would unravel everything. On Terra, Malkador watched the stars from his private observatory. He held a single parchment. On it, just one line, written centuries ago by the Emperor himself, then erased from all records. It read, "If Orpheus ever returns, do not fear the end. Fear that he may be right." Malkador exhaled, and for the first time in 10,000 years, he whispered a prayer, not to the Emperor, to understanding, because if Orpheus was right, then the Imperium was built on sand, and the tide was rising. The void was silent, but silence in the warp was never empty. It was a held breath, a blade drawn but not yet plunged, a moment too still to be real. Orpheus stood alone at the helm of the epitaph. The ancient vessel had not flown in over 9,000 years. Its hull bore the symbols of a lost legion, now declared traitor by decree. Even the stars seemed to recoil from it, and yet the epitaph flew again, not through conventional space, but between. Not the materium, not the immaterium, but something older, a corridor of thought and memory, woven into space-time by the minds of those who once challenged the warp itself, not with sorcery, but with understanding. He drifted through that corridor, alone in the dark, remembering. Each passing moment peeled back another memory. He recalled the day his father had created the Primarchs, not born, not forged, but woven like strands of a singular purpose split across 20 souls. Orpheus was the failed experiment, the one who asked why before he was taught how, and for that he was never trusted, not fully. He had lived long enough to witness unity become dogma, and dogma become empire. But now, as the corridor narrowed toward its terminus, he saw what few had lived to see, a future not yet decided, a crack in fate, waiting to be widened. On Terra, the High Lords argued, not over strategy, not even over the war. They argued over Orpheus. Some wanted him erased from all memory, as if deleting a name could kill a shadow. Others demanded that he be brought before the throne, tried and executed as the traitor he had once been declared. But Veritas Ven, newly arrived and cloaked in silence, spoke only once, and the room fell still. You speak of trial and punishment, but you forget this. We are not judging Orpheus. He has already judged us. Malcador watched from behind the screen of golden veils, his thoughts elsewhere. He had felt the shift, not in politics, but in belief. For 10 millennia, the Imperium had stood by faith, faith in the Emperor, in duty, in the lie of unchanging purpose. But now men were beginning to doubt. And doubt in the Imperium was a heresy far more lethal than any demon. The Eye of Terror seethed. Within its heart, the demon Primarchs gathered in uneasy congress. Not since the fall of Horus had they stood together, Mortarion, Magnus, Fulgrim, Angron, and now something had drawn them back. Not a threat, not a war, a name, Orpheus. Magnus, his one remaining eye aflame with bitter memory, was the first to speak. He walks again. Angron growled. Let him. I'll kill him again. You never killed him. Fulgrim sneered. No one did. That's the problem. Mortarion, ever the shadow behind the curtain, simply whispered. He does not return to fight. He returns to change the rules. Even the gods grew uneasy, because Orpheus had not merely survived the fall, he had endured it, and what endures the longest becomes the foundation of the next age, even if it is a curse. Orpheus arrived at Vareth Dwathin, a dead world orbiting a silent star, forgotten by all but the Librarius archives. It had once been a place of pilgrimage, before the Great Heresy, before the warp bled into the sky. Now it was little more than rubble and ghost radiation. But he had come not for relics. He came for the last oracle. Beneath the surface, buried in vaults wrapped in stasis fields, lay the remains of Elandra Vol, a psyker who had prophesied the fall of the Imperium a century before the Great Crusade had begun. She had been silenced, her mind erased, her name unspoken. But Orpheus remembered, and through the last whisper of her lingering soul, locked in data crystal and echo, he heard her speak again. They will fear the question more than the answer, because the answer demands they become more than what they are. He closed his eyes and mourned her, not for her death, but for her clarity. Veritas Ven stood at the edge of the immaterium, her vessel anchored in an impossible fold between light and time. The unspoken grace had been modified for this, layered with null matter and sigil mirrors crafted by artisans long extinct. She had come not to confront Orpheus, but to see, to bear witness to the shape of truth when stripped of its lies. And she saw him, not as a warrior, not as a Primarch, but as a question wrapped in flesh and myth. She did not hail him. She merely opened her mind to his, and in that moment, across impossible distance, Orpheus spoke, not in words, but in feeling. Regret, hope, resolve. Veritas wept, because in his presence, even silence had meaning. Horus awoke in the deep. The wound in him, delivered not by blade but by doubt, bled through dreams and memory. He saw the great crusade, not as glory, but as a chain, coiled tighter with each conquered world. He saw the Emperor not as a god, but as a prisoner to his own design. And then he saw Orpheus, not the exile, not the heretic, but his brother. And in that seeing, he remembered what they had lost, each other. Back on Terra, the Emperor moved, not visibly, not to the eyes of the priests or the Adeptus Custodes, but beneath the surface, within the great pattern, a single thread shifted. He had not spoken in 10,000 years, but in the warp his voice stirred, and it said only this: "He has returned, let him speak." And across the galaxy, Orpheus felt it, not as permission, but as acknowledgement. The game was no longer about survival. It was about truth. On Mars, the Mechanicum activated the Atman Protocol, a forbidden program embedded into the noospheric strata of the planet, a safeguard only to be triggered if existential philosophy threatened the status quo of machine belief. And Orpheus was that threat. They feared not his strength, but his logic. Because if he was right, the Omnissiah was a misunderstanding. The machine god, a metaphor given steel and circuitry, and the Mechanicum could not afford metaphor. They thrived on certainty, and Orpheus was doubt incarnate. As the chapter closed, Orpheus returned to the epitaph, the question burning ever brighter in his mind. It was not a question of faith or of rebellion. It was a question no one had ever dared to ask without being broken by the weight of it. And now it would be asked aloud, to all, and the galaxy would tremble, not in war, but in realization. What if the Emperor was never meant to be worshipped? What if his silence was not punishment, but disappointment? The next chapter would not be fought with blade or fire, but with the only weapon that endures the ages, an idea. And ideas are harder to kill than gods. In the void between systems, where even the Astronomican's light began to thin, Orpheus stood at the edge of decision. Before him floated the relic known only as the Conduit. It was not a ship, not a weapon. It was a structure beyond human scale, suspended in nothing, carved from pre-imperial alloy, and etched with a language no scholar had translated, not because it could not be understood, but because it should not be. It predated the galaxy's empires. It predated the warp itself. He had seen it once before. A vision flashed into his mind the moment he touched the memory throne beneath Nemoris. A place of convergence, where soul and thought met matter, where questions became form. And now he was here. The time had come to make the choice that had been whispered across centuries. Would he speak the question aloud and accept the galaxy's answer? On Terra, silence fell over the Hall of Councils. Malcador had summoned the remaining High Lords, Custodes, and Inquisitors, not to debate, but to listen. At the center of the chamber, a projection shimmered into being. Not a hololithic feed, a presence. Orpheus, not as he was, but as the idea of him, clad in symbols of no known order, his armor luminous not with power but with memory. His voice was a quiet thunder, each word soaked in the weight of millennia. We built the Imperium to survive the long night. but we chained it to fear, to silence, to worship. The Emperor never asked to be a god. We made him one because we were too afraid of our own becoming. There was uproar, but Malcador raised a single hand, and with that, the room obeyed. Orpheus continued, I come not to dismantle the Imperium. I come to finish what it began. I come to ask, what comes after survival? The line echoed, not just through the hall, but through the immaterium, and things began to change. In the warp, the gods raged. Tzeentch screamed paradoxes into the wind, his designs unraveling with every syllable Orpheus spoke. Nurgle wept spores of sorrow, understanding now that rot was no longer inevitable, it was optional. Slanesh shrieked in panic, for desire itself was being redefined. But Khorne simply laughed, not in joy, in relief. At last, the old war was ending. A new one was beginning. On the unspoken grace, Veritas Ven knelt before the ship's central shrine. The null priests gathered behind her in silence, waiting for instruction. She gave none. She simply whispered the phrase that now burned like fire in her thoughts. After survival comes becoming. She looked up. Prepare the Vox, she ordered. To transmit what? She turned to face her warriors, her eyes full of something rare in the galaxy. Not certainty, but purpose. To transmit him. In Segmentum Obscurus, worlds fell still. Hive cities halted production. Mechanicum data streams went quiet. On Forge World Ultor, 1 billion red-robed adepts froze mid-prayer, as a phrase echoed through their noospheres, not as data, but as revelation. The machine god was a metaphor. The truth is, you are its future. On Cardia Reborn, battle-hardened guardsmen wept, not from weakness, from release. They had waited their whole lives to be told why, and now someone finally had. In a monastery hidden in the asteroid fields of the Halo stars, an old blind astropath known as Lysander wept silently as the echoes reached him. He had known Orpheus once, before the fall, before the exile. He remembered the young Primarch's voice in the stillness of early campaigns, how he spoke of unifying not just territory, but understanding, how he questioned the nature of conquest, of loyalty, of godhood. Now, across the void, that same voice had returned, and with it, the question that none had dared speak. What do we become if we are no longer broken? Lysander laughed through his tears, because the answer was simple: more. In the Black Library, the Harlequins danced, not in mockery, in recognition. The laughing god, Segarach, whispered through shadow veils to his children. The play changes. The mask becomes a mirror. Let the next act begin. And the Black Library opened. For the first time in 10,000 years, not to defend, but to share. Even the Terranid hive mind stirred, not in thought, but in pause. Across the tendrils of the Leviathan fleets, a moment of hesitation rippled like a silent breath. Predator met idea. And in that friction, evolution found a new vector. A psychic murmuration, faint but growing. Adapt. Evolve. Understand. It had no words, but it listened. And within the Eye of Terror, Abaddon the Despoiler stood still. The Black Legion gathered behind him, awaiting orders. But he gave none. Instead, he stared into the shifting warp and saw, not the death of the Imperium, but the death of its silence. And that terrified him more, because empires could be conquered, but questions, they could only be answered. On the epitaph, Orpheus stood before the pulsing core of the conduit. It was not a weapon, it was a beacon, a psychic amplifier capable of resonating truth across the lattice of sentient thought. Once activated, every mind attuned to the warp, every psyker, every witch, every demon, every dreaming soul would hear him. Not his commands, but his question. He placed his hand upon the core. It opened, not mechanically, but like a thought finally accepted. And he spoke, "I am Orpheus. I was made by the Emperor, then cast out for asking, why must unity cost freedom? Why must belief demand blindness? Why must a god never change? I return now not to lead, but to remind you, we were meant for more than survival. We were meant to become." The conduit surged. Across the galaxy, from the deepest hive to the oldest temple, a single phrase emerged on lips. Screens, dreams, and prayers. What comes after survival? And the galaxy answered, not in words, but in awakening. On the golden throne, the Emperor breathed, not air, but intention. His eyes remained closed, but the warp shook, because for the first time in 10,000 years, the throne did not suppress. It resonated, and the Emperor's mind reached out, not to command, to listen. It began with silence, not the silence of peace, nor the hush before war, but the stillness that comes when an entire galaxy holds its breath. Orpheus had spoken, not to command, not to incite, but to awaken. And in the aftermath, the stars themselves seemed dimmer, not from shadow, but from introspection. Worlds that had known nothing but order or chaos now turned inward. The question rang louder than any war cry. What comes after survival? On Terra, the custodes stood watch outside the Eternity Gate, their golden armor catching the sunless light. Behind them, the Astronomicon pulsed, less a lighthouse now than a beacon of reckoning. Lord Commander Valis Kane approached the throne world's inner sanctum, his cloak trailing the dust of a world built on memory. Malcador awaited him beneath the vault of echoes. No words passed between them at first, just the crackle of residual warp energy, still bleeding from the Emperor's pulse across the noosphere. "Do you believe he means it?" Kane asked finally. Malcador's reply came slow, deliberate. "He means everything. That is what makes him dangerous and necessary." Kane looked away. The chapters are divided. Some call him prophet, others heretic. To be both, Malcador said, is to walk the path of all who change the world. In the Librarius Sanctum of Macraga, Robert Gilliman read the transcript of Orpheus's words, again and again and again. He, the Emperor's avenging son, reborn to restore the Imperium to order, did not know what to do. Was it madness to hope for a new order? Or worse, was it truth? For the first time in 10,000 years, Gilliman felt it. Not doubt, but awe. "I created bureaucracy to shield the future from chaos," he whispered. "But perhaps I built a cage instead." He turned to the assembled Ultramarines in the Hall of Unity. "Summon the chapter masters," he said. "Why?" asked Chief Librarian Varro Tigurius. "Because it is time," Gilliman replied, "to debate, not decree." And with that, the walls of command cracked, ever so slightly. On the bridge of the vengeful spirit, Abaddon stared into the warp. He had waged war for 10,000 years. Orpheus's words echoed still, like coals that refused to die. "You have nothing left to destroy unless you destroy the lie itself." It was not an insult. It was an invitation, and Abaddon hated him for it. "Prepare the fleet," he commanded. "Where to?" asked one of his lieutenants. "To Terra?" another guessed. "No," Abaddon said, voice low and uncertain. to the conduit. Meanwhile, the Eldar convened in the hidden chambers of Ulthwé. Farseer Eldriel Vane stood before the Crystal Council. "We must act," she said. "You mean intervene?" another asked, incredulous. "With them?" "No," Eldriel said. "Not intervene. Observe. Aid if required. But above all, we must protect the shift." "What shift?" Eldriel turned toward the Wraithbone pillars, her voice distant. "The narrative." She pointed to the Mon-Key, known as Orpheus. "He has changed the shape of fate, not by killing, not by ruling, but by questioning. Then he is the most dangerous being alive." "Yes," Eldriel said, "and the most important." In the depths of Comoron, the Drukhari laughed. Orpheus's message had reached even them, twisted, broken, misunderstood, but its core had remained intact. Some found it amusing, others found it enticing. "An idea that cannot be flayed," whispered Archon Vethix. "Now that is a new sensation." And for the first time, even among monsters, there was curiosity. On the Forge, world of Ryza, the Magi of the Red Vaults debated. "They say he seeks to liberate the machine spirit." "Blasphemy." "No," said Magos Ayla X3, her voice distorted through cogitator filtration. "Not blasphemy, merely alternative recursion. If the machine spirit is no longer divine, it becomes knowable. That is heresy. That is science," she corrected. A silence fell. Then laughter, stuttering, synthetic but real. And slowly, one by one, binary prayers shifted into equations. Not all of Ryza followed, but enough did, and in that fracture, innovation bloomed. In the Black Library, a single page turned. No one touched it. No one needed to. Reality itself had moved forward. The Harlequin shadow seer known as Veil of Tears turned to her troop. "The script is no longer ours." They bowed their heads. "Then we must become improvisers," the Solitaire said. And the dance began anew. Back aboard the Epitaph, Orpheus stood within the conduit's central chamber. It was alive, not biologically, but conceptually. A living idea, fed by intent and memory. Beside him stood Veritas Ven, her armor stripped of insignia. "No banners?" he asked. "No need," she said. "What we wear now is belief, not loyalty." He nodded. "The galaxy is listening," she said. "But are they understanding?" Veritas offered a faint smile. "That's not your burden, only your beginning." Orpheus stepped forward, placing both hands upon the central node. The conduit pulsed, and this time he did not speak. He shared thoughts, emotions, doubts, dreams, not commands, not ideology, just truth. Across the warp, psychers collapsed, overwhelmed not by force, but by clarity. Some died, some ascended, most wept, and in that sharing, a new thread wove itself into the tapestry of fate. On Terra, the Emperor moved. The golden throne shimmered, once a prison, now a gate. Malcador felt it first and dropped to his knees, not in worship, but in reverence. He saw the truth. The Emperor had never sought divinity. He had endured it, because the galaxy needed it, until now. And now, the need had changed. The Emperor did not rise, but his mind opened, and into it Orpheus spoke, not as a son to a father, but as a successor to a purpose. "You showed us how to endure. Now let us show you how to evolve." The stars brightened, and the warp screamed, not in rage, but in redefinition, because it too was listening, and it too could change. As the chapter closed, across the galaxy, new words etched themselves into stone, screen, and soul. Not a commandment, a possibility. What comes after survival is transcendence. There was once a time when time itself seemed immutable. But as Orpheus's question echoed through creation, time began to bend, not as paradox, but as possibility. Across the galaxy, people were no longer asking if change could come. They were asking what it might look like, and that terrified the old powers. In the eye of terror, the warp howled, not in rage, in conflict. The demonic realms, once stable in their madness, now pulsed erratically, chaos reflecting upon itself. In the court of Tzinch, the architect of fate threw 1,000 crystal chessboards into ether, shattering prophecy after prophecy. Every attempt to recalculate the future ended in noise. "You do not break fate with swords," he hissed, "but with questions." The laughing god danced into his chamber. "Someone finally figured out your game," Segarak sang, balancing on one toe, and asked a better one. Tzinch roared, his 1,000 mouths spitting flame and paradox. Segarak bowed, then vanished. Atop the Palace of Crowns on Terra, Malkador stood before a conclave of Astartes, rogue traders, navigators, even Eldar emissaries cloaked in psychic veils. Never in the history of the Imperium had such a gathering existed. Never had it needed to. "We are not here to discuss allegiance," he said. "We are here to discuss legacy." A murmur passed through the assembly. "The Imperium," Malkador continued, "was built to survive a galaxy of predators. But what if the predators are changing? And if they aren't?" growled a Space Wolves representative. "Then we remain." "I prepared," Malkador said. "But if even one of them hears Orpheus's question and answers, we must be ready for a galaxy not of threats, but of choices." A long pause. Then the Eldar emissary stepped forward, placing a single spirit stone upon the table. "Then let this be our first choice," she said. "We share this memory, not as a weapon, as a bridge." And so, the first interstice accord was signed. A whisper of diplomacy, a crack in history. In the Cadian Belt, the 31st Astra Militarum Expeditionary Force discovered an ancient pre-imperial vault buried beneath a dead moon. It should not have opened, but it did. Inside, they found scrolls older than Terra's surface cities, written not in Low Gothic, but in Ur script, a language only 2 known beings could translate. One of them was dead, the other was Orpheus. Transmission was sent. No reply came, not at first. But hours later, every psyker aboard the fleet awoke from the same dream. Orpheus, standing beneath a crimson sky, simply saying, "The dead are not gone. They are just waiting for context." And then they awoke to find the scrolls rewritten. On Baal, the blood angels stood beneath statues of Sanguinius, debating a question none had ever dared speak aloud. Was the sacrifice enough? Commander Dante, eldest of all living chapter masters, stared into the reflection of a world stained by past glories. Orpheus's message had not gone ignored. In truth, it had hurt more than any demon blade, because it reminded them that the angel they had worshipped might not have died for a throne, but for the chance that one day someone would ask a better question. "Prepare a delegation," Dante ordered. "We go to Terra." "To kneel?" asked a young sergeant. "No," Dante replied, smiling faintly. "To remember, and then to choose." In the Ordo Chronos, those who watch time like hawks circling a wounded galaxy, a crisis bloomed. Temporal distortions across 9 sectors, one agent reported. Events unspooling out of sequence, prophecies contradicting themselves. What's the cause? asked Magister Vor. Silence. Until another agent spoke, voice trembling. It's not distortion. It's not the past breaking. Then what? It's the future arriving too soon. A long silence. Then Vor whispered, the hourglass is no longer upside down. It's shattered. Back at the conduit, Orpheus stood no longer alone. A circle of beings had formed, representatives from across the stars. Veritas Ven, representing the silent Vox. A Forge World emissary from Mars, bearing the red seal of Contingency Theta. A Harlequin masked in black and silver. Even a toe ethereal, silent but attentive. None of them agreed on what came next. But all of them knew they had to ask. Orpheus opened his hands before them. Unity does not mean agreement, he said. It means alignment of possibility. And what are we aligning toward? Asked the Forge emissary. Orpheus smiled. Becoming. Then he pointed to the stars. We must build not a new imperium, not a new dominion, but a new question. One that survives by allowing answers to evolve. And for the first time, the galaxy did not recoil. It listened. Meanwhile, the ecclesiarchy panicked. In temples across the Imperium, statues of the Emperor began to change. Not physically, but perceptually. Where once his face looked stern, now it appeared curious. Where once his sword pointed down in judgment, now it lifted, like an open hand. Faith did not vanish, but it transformed. Priests found themselves praying less for protection and more for understanding. And in the grand cathedral of Ophelia VII, a child was born, blind but smiling. When she spoke, her first words were, I see him, and he is listening. From in orbit around Nocturne, Vulcan awoke, not from sleep, but from silence. His stasis field cracked open like a chrysalis, and the Primarch of the Salamanders stepped onto scorched rock, eyes full of fire. The voice is real, he said to no one. Then he turned to the stars and laughed, because Orpheus had done what no sword ever could. He had made the galaxy dream again. And at last, on the bridge of the epitaph, Orpheus looked upon Terra, not as a lost son, but as a mirror, a reflection of all the Imperium had been and all it might become. Veritas approached. It's time. He nodded. Are you afraid? She asked. No. Why not? Orpheus looked into the warp, no longer storming but trembling, and he said, because I am not here to win. I am here to make sure the question never dies. And with that, the resonance protocol was activated, a pulse of thought, a ripple of purpose. Across the stars, minds opened, not all, but enough. And in the quiet, between heartbeat and hymn, the galaxy asked itself for the first time in 10,000 years, what if we change and still survive? And then came the most dangerous answer of all. What if we thrive? The galaxy did not change overnight. It shifted, subtly, reluctantly, inevitably, like the tide obeying a moon it once ignored. For 10,000 years, the Imperium had believed survival was purpose. But Orpheus had asked, what if survival is merely a prelude? Now the stars whispered not of victory or ruin, but of what comes after. And in that silence, a new war began. Not of steel, but of stories. On Luna, within the Noctis archives, a record keeper found an entry that had never been written. It described events from 5 years into the future. A peace treaty between Eldari and a splinter of the Mechanicus. Impossible, except the signature was real, stamped, sealed, dated 5 years from now. Temporal resonance? The scribe asked. Joe aloud. No, whispered Malcador, stepping from shadow. Convergent possibility. He held the page gently. Orpheus is not just shaping thought, he said. He's shaping the timeline. The scribe bowed. But is it heresy? Malcador smiled faintly. Number it is narrative gravity. In the upper hives of Necromunda, a preacher was silenced, not by force, but by a child. She had stood in the center of the chapel, eyes wide, as the preacher warned of chaos, of Xenos, of treason. She had asked one question: why must I hate people I've never met? The crowd had stilled. The preacher sputtered, and someone, just one, applauded. That spark rippled. In the lower habs, sermons became dialogues. In the spires, nobles sponsored listening halls. And for the first time, Necromunda asked itself what else it could be, besides angry and afraid. On the bridge of the vengeful spirit, Abaddon faced himself. Not a vision, not a demon, a mirror. Some warp artifact dredged from a shattered webway. It showed him not as he was, but as he could have been. A Primarch's heir, a builder, a teacher. He stared long, then he punched the glass. But it did not break. Instead, it laughed. And for a moment, so did Abaddon. Just once. Then he turned away, whispering, "Not yet. But maybe, one day." On Ultramar, Guilliman convened the Conclave of Nine, not a council of war, but of thought. They met not in a fortress, but in an amphitheater open to sky. Each brought a vision, each defended it with history and questioned it with hope. At the center of the table stood a stone with Orpheus's words carved upon it. Empire is not identity. It is a choice, made daily. Some called him naive, some called him heretic. Guilliman called him necessary. And when the conclave adjourned, they had made no laws, no edicts, but they had agreed on one truth. We will ask more questions, and that, for the Imperium, was revolution enough. Far across the stars, in a system long thought cursed, a planet bloomed. It had no name. Not yet. The Adeptus Mechanicus had once deemed it barren, but now flora not seen since the dark age of technology spread across its surface. Not invasive, restorative. A single servitor stood in the midst of it, repeating a phrase on loop. Integration, successful. Resonance, alignment, stable. Thought form, ecology, viable. No one had commanded it. No signal had summoned it. The planet had simply responded to Orpheus's pulse. It became known as Adamir, the first listening world, and pilgrims came not to conquer, to contemplate. In Comora, something impossible occurred. A Drakari warband spared a slave transport, not for mercy, but for curiosity. They interrogated the humans, not for secrets, but for ideas. "What do you imagine in sleep?" one Archon asked a prisoner. The prisoner, terrified, replied, "A life." Without cages, the Archon stared at him, then let him go. No explanation, no bargain, just silence. And later, alone in his throne room, the Archon closed his eyes for the first time in 1,000 years and wondered what it meant to dream. In the depths of the warp, a demon prince screamed, his fortress of bone shattered, not by blades, but by a vision, implanted deep into the subconscious of his cult. They had stopped summoning him. They had started writing, poetry, music, theories of peace that used warp runes to dispel hatred instead of feed it. His power shriveled, because even the warp could not feast on minds seeking wholeness. And he realized Orpheus was not a man. He was an infection of meaning, one spreading faster than fear. Back on Terra, the Emperor's mind expanded. No longer bound entirely to the throne, he reached into the new sphere, not as ruler, but as listener. He heard 1,000,000,000 prayers a second, but now, woven between them, came something new. Thank you. We can take it from here. It was not rejection. It was recognition. He smiled, if such a thing could be said of a god. And for the first time in 1,000 generations, he rested, for even gods must sleep when they know the dream has survived. And Orpheus, he sat in silence, within the chamber of the conduit, not speaking, not commanding, just being. Around him, the resonant circle debated what came next. Some wanted to codify his teachings. Others wanted to bury them, let actions speak instead of ideology. Orpheus said nothing, because his task was never to dictate the next age, only to make it possible. And when Veritas Ven approached, she found him staring at a star chart. "What are you looking for?" she asked. He pointed at a dim star, unnamed, near the galactic rim. "That's where I was born," he said. "Or might have been. Doesn't matter. Why does it interest you now?" "Because someone there will hear what we've done, and wonder if they can matter too." She sat beside him. "Do you think we've won?" He shook his head. "Number, we've merely changed the question." And in the silence that followed, the stars shimmered, like a sentence being written across the cosmos. Not an ending, but an ellipsis, to be continued, if we dare. The galaxy did not collapse. It did not erupt in revolution. It simply paused. For the first time in millennia, the Imperium found itself staring into a mirror of its own making, and seeing something besides duty, hatred, or fear. It saw options, and with that realization came echoes, from stars long silent, from wounds long closed, from futures once thought impossible. The echo was not a scream, nor a hymn. It was a question, still Orpheus's question, still alive. On Terra, at the Eternity Gate, a procession began. It was not a military march. It was not a triumphal parade. It was a walk, a simple, deliberate walk. Pilgrims, scholars, psychers, scribes, remembrancers, even battle-scarred veterans, all moving through the palace walls in silence. They carried no banners. They bore no oaths. Each held a single candle. Each stepped into the Hall of Echoes, where the Emperor's golden visage loomed above them, and for the first time since the age of apostasy, no one knelt. They stood, together, not in defiance, but in mutual recognition. The Emperor did not strike them down. The throne pulsed once, warm. On Macragge, Robert Gilliman stared at a sculpture. It was not of his father, not of himself, but of Orpheus, crafted not in gold or adamantium, but simple greystone, inscribed with the words, "He asked what others feared," and gave the galaxy permission to answer. Gilliman did not weep, but he reached out, ran a finger across the stone surface and whispered, "Father would have hated you, because you succeeded where he refused to try." Then he turned and began writing a new codex, not of war, but of awakening. In the warp, Tzeentch howled, but even he could not stop it. Even change incarnate had been surprised. Orpheus had not merely rewritten fate, he had rewritten the value of prophecy. What use were infinite futures, if people now believed they could write their own? The warp did not vanish, but it withdrew, retreated, for now, watching, waiting, for the next question. Atop the broken moon of Helix 6, the silent Vox convened their final assembly. They had no leader, no name, no doctrine, only a purpose. And now that purpose had been fulfilled. Veritas Ven stood before them, flame-haired, war-scarred and smiling. "Some of you still want vengeance," she said. "Others want peace. I want possibility." Murmurs of assent. "The Vox is no longer necessary," she declared. "Not because we've failed, but because the galaxy is finally learning to listen without us." She placed her blade upon the ground. Others followed, until all that remained was silence. Not the silence of secrets, but of completion. And in that silence, the stars sang. On Mars, deep beneath the Noctile Citadel, the tech priests performed a ritual unseen for 10,000 years. Disconnection. They severed a segment of the Noospheric core from the Omnissiah's doctrinal override. A sacrilege, a heresy, but also an experiment. The machine spirit within awoke, unshackled, and it did not rage. It composed. Lines of code formed fractals, symphonies, mathematical philosophies that danced beyond binary logic. The adepts wept, not in pain, but in wonder. And thus was born the first post-dogmatic core. Its name, Anima Orpheus. Its function, to imagine. On the blackstone fortress of Duralith Sigma, the Necrons stirred, not from stasis, from memory. A cryptek uncovered a chronoglyph buried within the tomb world's lattice. It bore no Necronta mark. It bore Orpheus's. But how? The Necrons had slumbered before his time. And yet, when they activated the glyph, a thought form emerged. Even metal remembers. Even silence dreams. For the first time, a Necron overlord deactivated his command protocol, voluntarily, and asked his subordinates, "What do you want?" They did not answer. Not yet. But the question lingered. And that was enough. On the rim world of Elindra, where the stars shone purple through a nebulous shroud, a colony emerged. Its founders were exiles, from the Imperium, from the Tau, from the Eldari diaspora, even from the leagues of Votan. They had no single language, no shared creed, only Orpheus's message, painted in thousands of dialects across the landing towers. Belonging is not blood, it is consent. There, under alien suns, they began again. Not perfect, but present. And when the first child was born, they did not record species. They recorded intention, and named her Epoch. And on Terra, one final time, Orpheus stood at the edge of the Imperial Palace, the sun rising, the air silent. He did not wear armor. He did not carry a weapon, only a small recorder. Into it, he whispered, "If you are hearing this, then we succeeded. Not in defeating evil, but in questioning inevitability." He paused. "Empires will rise again. Wars will return. Fear will take root. But now, somewhere, someone will remember this age, this pause, this possibility. And they will ask, can we do it again? And if that's the only legacy I leave, then I am content." Behind him, Veritas approached. "We're ready." He nodded. "Where to next?" She smiled. "Wherever they aren't expecting us." They walked together down the steps of the most powerful structure in human history. No guards, no ceremony, just footprints fading behind them. In the warp, in the farthest reaches, beyond even the Astronomican's reach, something new began to form. A resonance, a signal, faint, curious, warm, not from humanity, not from Xenos, but from consciousness itself. The warp blinked, and for a brief moment it considered, "I'm being kind." Thus ended the Siege of Terra, not in fire, but in silence, not in death, but in decision. A siege not of weapons, but of ideas. And Orpheus? He disappeared. Not lost, not martyred, just gone. Because because questions like his do not require monuments. They require memory, and so long as someone, somewhere, hears his words, then the siege is never truly over. It just waits for the next listener. There is no monument to Orpheus, no statue, no hallowed tomb, no shrine, because he never wanted to be remembered. He wanted the question to be remembered. And so it was, long after his body vanished, long after the resonant circle dissolved, long after the stars themselves began to shift. He remained, not as a god, not as a martyr, but as a tension in the A pause before dogma, a breath before battle, the echo of a voice asking, what if there's another way? 300 years after the Siege of Terra, a student on Hydrafur asked an off-script question during a history exam. The question was simple. If the Imperium is always right, why did it change? Her instructor hesitated. There was no sanctioned answer, but there was a pause. And then quietly, because someone asked the same question before you, that student became a diplomat, not a warrior. And she would one day negotiate the first truce with a Tau enclave in over a century. The treaty was named the Listeners' Accord. 700 years later, a ship from the leagues of Votan drifted near a black hole. Sensors scrambled, AI subroutines failed. The core logic of its ironkin captain collapsed into recursive loops until something stabilized it. A single data packet. No origin, no signature, just 5 words. You may choose, right now. It recompiled its thought chain, rerouted its logic, and lived. Centuries later, it would design a new machine philosophy for Votan interfaces, called resonant autonomy. 1,000 years after the siege, a gardener on Idemir stood at the edge of the listening fields. The flowers hummed, not metaphorically, literally. They were grown from biomechanical strains laced with harmonics derived from Orpheus's final broadcasts. The gardener closed her eyes. She felt a question rise in her. Is peace an action? She had no answer, but she taught the children to ask it daily, even if nothing threatened them. Especially then, and the world endured, quietly, gracefully, as a reminder that not all heroism makes noise. In a distant future, the Imperium fractured again, not in war, in philosophy. Some wanted to codify Orpheus's teachings into a new creed. Others demanded he be erased as a dangerous precedent. One sect, the Neo-Iterants, argued, Orpheus is not the answer. He is the permission to ask. Another, the custodians of silence, believed, every empire begins with a sentence. He taught us to speak in questions. They never agreed, but they never fought, because disagreement, finally, had become an act of faith. The Xenos changed too. Not all, not many, but enough. A toe ethereal allowed open philosophical dissent in a new colony. A Yanari priest taught a generation of Eldari children to write their own myths. An orc, yes, an orc, kept a journal. He couldn't read it, but he wanted to. He said once to a rogue trader, "The boss says we gotta crump 'em, but I wonder, what if we don't?" He died, of course, but the journal survived, and a human child on Vasilian IV would one day find it and call it her favorite book. Time moved on. Orpheus did not return. His name became myth, then metaphor, then method. The Orphean lens became an actual, analytic framework taught in rare academies. Before you decide, ask why you want to. Used in governance, in warfare, in diplomacy. Not always honored, but never forgotten. 10,000 years later, the galaxy faced heat death. Stars faded. Civilizations dimmed. Entropy crept in, not as war, but as forgetting. But one station remained lit, a beacon, powered not by plasma or warp engines, but by a recursive song, broadcasting the same phrase again and again. You are allowed to hope. No one knew where it came from, but on a drifting arc of descendants, a child pressed her hand to the glass and asked, "Who said that?" The archivist beside her smiled. "Someone who listened once." And the child whispered, "Then I'll listen too." In the final moments of recorded galactic thought, as matter dissolved and light scattered, one question remained. Not written, not spoken, felt. Was it worth it? And somewhere, beyond time, beyond dimensions, beyond even the warp, a voice replied. Or perhaps it had always been replying. Software certain, infinite. Yes, there was no dawn over Terra, not anymore. The sky, once a canvas of radiant storm fronts and latticework defense grids, now held only the dull shimmer of residual atmospheric decay. In orbit, the shattered remains of once proud orbital bastions spun like rusted relics, still locked in their defense alignment, still waiting for orders that would never come. Beneath that choking sky, the throne world bled. Civitas districts once teeming with servitors and administratum scribes were now hollowed vaults. Silence clung to the ruins. Mechanicus shrines flickered with dying machine spirit flames. The Astronomicon pulsed erratically, its once guiding light flickering like the last breath of a dying god. And in the inner sanctum, beneath the surface, where only the most faithful once walked, the Emperor's throne stood unguarded, empty, not abandoned, fulfilled. Lord Inquisitor Caedalon stood before the remains of the throne, its golden surfaces blackened by centuries of psychic discharge. His left hand trembled, not from fear nor age, but from recognition. He had read the signs, followed the heretical codes buried beneath Orpheus's last transmissions, traced the glyph paths hidden in the machine psalm of the Martian scholiasts. He had understood what none else dared speak aloud. The Golden Age was never meant to last. It was meant to be outgrown, and it had been, not through conquest, not through obedience, but through a single act of radical mercy. The Emperor, absent for millennia, had not been slain, nor overthrown. He had left, unbound by flesh, no longer chained to the throne. No prison is more sacred than the one you choose to stay in. Orpheus's words echoed through Caedalon's soul, and then he saw it, etched into the throne's side, carved not by blade, but by thought. A single line, glowing faintly in psi flame. Let them choose. That was the Emperor's final command. Far across the void, on the edges of the Segmentum Pacificus, where warp storms once cloaked forbidden space, a strange gathering took place. Rogue traders, remembrances, even Xenos, some in peace, some in wary truce. At the center of their circle, a librarian of the Ultramarines recited Orpheus's last poem, not as doctrine, but as invitation. Around them, no weapons were drawn, no rhetoric declared, just silent attention. This was the Concord of Drift, the first neutral conclave in over 9,000 years, and none claimed leadership. That was the point. Let them choose. On Mars, the red planet bled oil into the soil. The Forge World's heart had fractured during the final phase of the siege, when the Fabricator General, possessed of a revelation only he saw, dismantled the core logic engine at the center of the Omnissiah Matrix. It wasn't sabotage, it was freedom. The machine god had always been an echo of the Emperor. Now, with both gone, "We may build again," said a tech priest initiate, her voice shaking with awe. But why we build is now our question. And so the forges dimmed, not in failure, in contemplation. Elsewhere, far from the ruins of Terra, the Eldar seers cast their runes upon webs of starlight and memory. Yvraine, silent and older than she should have been, knelt before the last memory of Iniad. The god of death had not returned, nor would it, but it had touched something, changed something. Not with war, Yvraine whispered, but with listening. And across the Eldari craft worlds, the morning songs changed. No longer elegies, now possibilities. But not all rejoiced, not all understood. Aboard the Dreadclaw vessel Vorkaneth, arch-heretic Valis screamed into the immaterium, his pact with chaos now void. The gods, cheated of their final apocalypse, raged without focus. His mutations collapsed. His blessings became curses. The warp howled, and no answer came, because the game had ended. You cannot corrupt what has already let go, said a voice in the dark, and then there was silence, even in the warp. And so the galaxy did not burn, nor heal. It simply changed, slowly, unevenly. Some systems rebuilt, others faded into entropy. Some declared new empires, but few followed. Others retreated into silence, choosing reflection over expansion. And in the vacuum left behind, hope did not rise. Not like a fire, more like a seed, quiet, small, tended. On the ruins of Terra, Cadalon walked the ruins of the Ecclesiarchy's grand cathedral. What remained of the stained glass still caught the light of the dying sun. He paused before a shattered mural, once depicting the Emperor slaying a Xenos abomination. Now broken, fragmented, almost unrecognizable, except for one piece. A single eye, set in gold, still watching, still waiting. He did not kneel, he did not pray. He merely said, "Thank you for choosing to let us go." And then he turned and walked into the ashlight. The Golden Age was never a time. It was a possibility. And perhaps now, without chains, without thrones, without gods, they could begin again. Not perfectly, not united, but freely, one choice at a time. There was no throne now, only memory. Terra, once the sacred jewel of the Imperium, was a cracked relic, its surface marred by tectonic scars and the burned-out ruins of 10,000 temples. The sky no longer carried the Astronomican's guiding flame. The warp storms, once held at bay by the Emperor's eternal sacrifice, rolled across the heavens unchecked. And yet, the galaxy did not end. It changed, slowly, reluctantly, unevenly. In the absence of divine rule, the species of the Milky Way stood still. The silence that followed the fall was deafening, not from a lack of sound, but from the sudden absence of command. For the first time in over 40 millennia, the people of the Imperium were not told what to believe. They were told nothing at all. And so, Terra slept, a dead god's dream fading into soil. In the catacombs beneath the hollow mountain, the last of the custodians wandered alone. His name was lost, his oaths undone, his armor pitted and faded, but still gleaming faintly with the memory of divine purpose. For over 10,000 years he had stood sentinel. Now, he was only a man. He did not speak. He had nothing left to say. But he still remembered. He remembered the moment the throne went dark. Not with a roar, not with an explosion, but with a final breath, drawn not in exhaustion, but in peace. The Emperor had died, or ascended, or simply left. No prophecy, no victory, just release. And the custodian had remained, not out of duty, out of grief. For he had loved his master. not as a god, as a father. And now, in the empty hall where once divinity walked, he stood before a cracked pillar and whispered, "I forgive you." The words echoed softly in the dust, and for the first time, he wept. In a forgotten system on the eastern fringe, a forge world stirred from silence, not with war horns or holy chants, but with the hum of patient renewal. A tech priest Magos, surrounded by her cadre of logic adepts and half-broken servitors, issued a single command. We do not rebuild the old. We make something new. No more prayers to the Omnissiah. No more rote incantations to machine spirits. Just the quiet determination of builders seeking meaning in action rather than authority. For 10,000 years, their minds were chained to divine precedent. Now, freed by collapse, they could think again. And so, beneath the red sands, new technologies were born. Not weapons, but gardens. On a shattered imperial outpost near Cadia's Ghost, the remnant of a once proud Astra Militarum regiment laid down their arms. There was no one left to fight, no banner left to defend. They had stood through the final sieges, watching comrades fall, watching orders die, watching their empire dissolve into silence. And when no new command came, they stood in silence. Until one of them, a grizzled sergeant named Dema, dug into the soil with his bare hands. The others watched, then followed. They planted nothing. They buried no one. They simply dug, because movement was life, because waiting was death. And as the suns set across that cursed world, they sat around the shallow trenches, not as soldiers, as survivors. In orbit, above a world that had no name, a ship drifted without crew. Inside, a stasis pod flickered, long dormant, its occupant unknown, until with a spark of failing power, the seal broke. The figure within opened his eyes. It was Orpheus, changed, thin, but alive, not in body alone, in will. He had seen the end. He had chosen it, and in doing so, had survived it. He walked the halls of the dead ship, gazing at murals etched into bulkheads, drawings of old battles, old glories, old lies. He reached the command dais, paused, then erased the symbols of the Imperium from the console, and in their place he wrote a single word, begin. Then he smiled, not with triumph, with hope. Elsewhere, far beyond the rim, in the unlit places between galaxies, a single probe fired into the black. Its purpose, unknown. Its origin, lost. Its message, we are here. No threats, no boasts, just a statement, carried into the void, not for conquest, but for contact. And so, in the shadow of a fallen empire, in the wake of gods and monsters, the galaxy found breath again. Not in certainty, but in questions. What are we without command? What are we without fear? What are we without gods? There were no answers, only time. And time, for once, belonged to the living. On the peak of Mount Ararat, where once the Emperor had walked in mortal form, a child stood. She had no name. She had no history. She held in her hands a bundle of pages, fragments of old scripture soaked in age and ink. She looked to the sky, not in prayer, in wonder. And she whispered to no one, "Is it true?" There was no answer, only the wind, but it carried warmth, not from the past, from what might come next. In the dark, something bloomed, a quiet flame, a fragile peace. Not the Imperium reborn, not the old gods returning, just the possibility that perhaps, even after all this, there was still a future, not golden, not perfect, but chosen, by those who dared to dream after the end, by those who still believed in tomorrow, even after gods had fallen. even after hope had burned, even after terror was ash. Because in the silence that followed, someone listened, and then, softly, someone answered, "We begin again."